Hello, everybody. I am Nichole Jocson and my partner is Illeona Godinez, and we are going to report about utilitarianism. So this topic has been preempted by previous reports, even starting from the first report. And now that we are more familiar with the general view of utilitarianism, let us now discuss about John Stuart Mill's writing, which is entitled Utilitarianism. Next slide, please. Okay, so John Stuart Mill was born in 1806 and died on 1873, was an English philosopher, economist, and exponent of utilitarianism. So his father, James Mill, was the reason why at such a young age, John Stuart was already exposed to the writings of historians and philosophers. So John Stuart Mill had a lifelong goal of reforming the world in the interest of human well-being. And with this, he wrote Utilitarianism in 1861 with the goal to justify the utilitarian principle as the foundation of morals. And a classic proponent of utilitarianism is Jeremy Bentham, and he was the earliest expounder of the principle of utility. So according to Bentham, the principle of utility is property in any object whereby it tends to produce pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered, and that it should be the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So being greatly influenced by Bentham and the theory, Mill expounded utilitarianism and the principle of utility, which Bentham called the greatest happiness principle. Next slide, please. So we start off the discussion with the first idea dropped off by Mill, which is the summum bonum. So summum bonum means greatest good. This idea, according to Mill, is the foundation for morality, and that morality rests on the idea of summum bonum. So this means that all actions should be directed at attaining the greatest good for all. And more often than not, summum bonum is heard in religion, if it ever rings a bell on you. So remember how religion always tells us to do good, not only for ourselves, but also for the benefit of our neighbors. So with summum bonum sparking our interests, one question that is good to ask is, how do we evaluate what's good from what is bad? Next slide, please. Okay, so Mill opened the chapter by saying that 2,000 years later, philosophers are yet to come to a consensus on a set of standards to determine what is morally right from wrong. And yet, thinkers such as the philosophers, nor the mankind are far from coming to a conclusion on the matter of having a criterion. So Mill argued on the little progress which has been in the decision of controversy respecting the criterion of right and wrong. Next slide, please. Thereafter, it was said that while the sciences use particular truths to reveal or come up with a general, larger theory, the opposite is the case for practical arts, which includes philosophy, morality, and laws. In the practical arts, a general theory is used to derive particular truths. So to easily understand this, think about how people act with purpose at the top of mind, and they determine particular steps and actions in order to have a clear conception of what is being pursued. So they start off with the general theory or goal and identify the particular truths in which in this case are the steps or actions. And now as we move forward, we continue to ask, how do we test right and wrong? Next slide, please. Okay, so to answer the question, a test of right and wrong must be the means and not the consequence of having already ascertained it. It is important to understand that, according to Mill, actions are always done for the sake of an end. So the actions are the means while the end is the consequence. So we test the action to determine whether it is right or wrong in relation to the consequences. However, Mill says that many may find this idea wrong rather than already knowing whether something is right or wrong. But again, we go back to the idea presented earlier that there is still no criterion to judge whether an act is good or bad or right and wrong. So settling from knowing that the means are the test of right and wrong, we can now move on to the next question, which is, what helps us determine whether an action is right or wrong? Next slide, please. Okay, so we have the moral instinct or moral faculty, which is an awareness that gives us a general sense of moral judgment or the ability to discern right and wrong. So Mill addressed the issue on moral instinct if it can be used instead of determining the foundation of morality. So to outright argue on the issue, Mill said it cannot be used as replacement. Moral instinct only provides us with the general principles, as this natural faculty is the ability, again, to distinguish right and wrong. It is only a branch of our reasoning, but it cannot determine whether something is right or wrong in particular cases or instances. So it is important to understand that even if general laws help in moral thinking, morality is still not determined by analyzing individual actions, but by the application of the moral laws to the actions. So with this, we ponder on the question, do the means justify the end? Next slide, please. So there are two main schools of ethics or schools of thought. First, intuitive, and the next is inductive. So intuitive thinkers insist on the necessity of general laws. They think that moral laws are a priori or made up of pure reason and independent of experience. The second, which is the inductive, they agree that morality is about the application of general laws to individual cases. So they think that people can derive moral laws a posteriori or through observations and experience. But these two branches of thought hold on to the idea that morality is determined by the applications of general laws. And with this, we now move on to ask, what is the law for utilitarianism that would help us determine if the action is right or wrong? Next slide, please. Okay, so we have the principle of utility, which Bentham called the greatest happiness principle. So this is considered as the moral law in utilitarianism. This theory states that actions are right in the proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So this reverse of happiness or unhappiness and pain, you would know that an action is right on the premise of it giving you, and most especially other people, happiness or pleasure, and that the action is wrong if it increases unhappiness or pain. So in the next chapter, we are to expound more on utilitarianism, as well as how others have objected on the theory and Mill's take on them. This consequentialist theory is heavily embedded on the consequences being determinants of whether an act is right or wrong. So as we go further with the report, we now ask, how can this theory be a measure of good and bad?
In this chapter, Mill clarified the concept of utilitarianism, where he responded to the major arguments against utilitarianism, as he claimed that the concept of utilitarianism is typically misunderstood, as people interpret it as an opposition to pleasure, but in reality, it is defined as pleasure itself and the absence of pain, as mentioned by Nichole earlier. A common assumption to the greatest happiness principle is that one, the only things desirable as ends are pleasure and freedom from pain, and that all desirable things are desirable either for their inherent pleasure or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. This can be misunderstood as something that life has no higher end than pleasure. This leads to the common objection in Mill's own type is that utilitarianism conceives of human beings as if they were swine. As swine and the other lower types of animals live their lives focused on the pleasures of food, sex, sleep, and play. But as human beings, we are more capable of much more than those things. So shouldn't we aim for something higher than a life of pleasure? Mill thinks that critics of utilitarianism are wrong to equate with base or animalistic pleasure. Mill believes that the critics of the hedonistic lifestyle, a life in which pleasure is valued and pursued for its own sake, perverts human nature by reducing it solely to the seeking of pleasure. As what a human being finds pleasurable is not restricted to satisfying the basic urges and appetites, and that human pleasures are connected to the intellect. And I quote, human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness, which does not include their gratification. Another issue raised by Mill in this chapter is that the pleasure are only differentiated by the degree and duration. To resolve this, Mill stated that there are fundamental different kinds of pleasure, namely intellectual and sensual or animalistic pleasure. According to Mill, intellectual pleasures have the highest value. An example of which is the pleasure a doctor feels after discovering a cure to an illness, and the animalistic pleasures are lesser than human pleasures of the intellect, thus creating a qualitative difference that morality divides humans and animals. Of the two pleasures, if there be one to which all who have experience of both give a decided preference, that is the more desirable pleasure. This basically means that the best judge of which pleasures are superior between intellectual or sensual pleasure is someone who has experienced both kinds of pleasure. And based on experience, would usually choose the intellectual pleasure. One who has not experienced both is not properly fit to judge which is the more superior kind of pleasure among the two. So if a person who has experienced both types of pleasure and chose one over the other, even when there is no moral obligation pressuring that person to choose one over the other, or even when it is more inconvenient to achieve this kind of pleasure over the other, or when they will still choose this kind of pleasure over the other despite of its quantity, then it is the more superior kind of pleasure. This is why the intelligent and educated individuals should never consent to be a fool or an ignoramus, or why that person would rather be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool dissatisfied. However, Mill recognizes that there are people who would still choose lower or animalistic pleasure over intellectual pleasure. According to Mill, this is mainly because of the absence of their experience on the higher type of pleasure, or the absence of the higher faculty to experience higher kinds of pleasure. With this, Mill also stated that a higher being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy and is capable probably of more acute suffering. Thus, people with higher faculties has the ability to appreciate more kinds of pleasure, but this also comes with more opportunities for disappointment. Thus, people who have higher faculties are also more prone to suffering and are also harder to satisfy than those who do not. Nevertheless, Mill thinks this person is ultimately happier than the one whose standard of pleasure is low. Recognition of the superior pleasure means the one who pursues it vastly is more happy than would be otherwise obtained. Neil also discussed that utilitarianism is about maximizing the overall amount of happiness. This means that utilitarianism is not about maximizing the personal happiness of an individual, but the overall amount of happiness of everyone. An objection to this principle to this principle of utility is that happiness cannot be the end of all action because one, it is unattainable, and even if it is attainable in principle, people can do very well without it, as it does not have the highest value for humans. We responded that happiness being unattainable is false, as happiness is not continuous a pleasurable state, but only moments of pleasure, which according to Mill is attainable. Moreover, it is also stated that life may never be perfectly happy, but it could still be improved. Even if happiness were unobtainable, minimizing pain would still be worthwhile. On the other hand, Mill responded to the objection that people can do without being happy, but they can't do without the happiness of others. He stated that people do without happiness involuntarily or sometimes to bring about the happiness of others. And lastly, Mill responded to the critics saying that utilitarianism is a godless doctrine. Mill argues that utilitarianism can't be a godless doctrine, assuming that God wants happiness for his creations. Moreover, Mill stated that utilitarianism does not generally endorse actions that seem immoral but expedient, but those actions are rarely expedient in the long run. However, some object that expediency is equivalent to choosing an action to which is in one's most immediate self-interest, but Mill asserts that expediency is not equivalent to usefulness. And critics also say that utilitarianism is impractical because when a person makes decisions, it is impossible for them to always take the time to consider what will bring the greatest happiness. Mill responded to this, saying, and I quote, "This is exactly as if anyone were to say that it is impossible to guide our conduct by Christianity because there is not time on every occasion on which anything has to be done to read through the Old and New Testaments." In other words, if a Christian, for example, is not required to read through the Bible prior to deciding what is the right thing to do, then there is no reason to think that a utilitarian should undertake a complicated decision-making process before deciding how to act. So, a society that has cultivated utilitarian values consists of individuals who are used to making utilitarian choices, just like how Christians are used to decide what is the right thing to do without consulting the Bible.
Thanks, Ella, for a comprehensive report on the second chapter of utilitarianism. Now, I believe there is no other great way to understand our lessons, even readings like this that were written back in 1861, than to look for its relevance in our present day situations. And as we have talked about what utilitarianism is within the past 15 minutes or so, let us now put this into the Philippine context to know what utilitarianism is not about. So we have thought of this example, which is the widespread corruption in the Philippine government. As much as it brings joy to these officials and others who were able to benefit from what they were able to get, the action does not give happiness to the greater population. The citizens, especially the masses, are experiencing more than just unhappiness. They're experiencing pain, they experience poverty, and every day, the Filipinos work hard to be able to afford things and pay for taxes, which are actually payments for what the people in position have stolen. The corrupt people do actions that would produce happiness for themselves, which is not the point of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Thereafter, we better ask ourselves if we see what they are doing as right or wrong, and what are our guiding principles into evaluating if an act is right or wrong. Again, we have to keep in mind that we adhere to the standpoint that there is still no criterion that would tell us what is good from bad. But it will also be good to open the topic of the Philippines as a Christian-dominated country. In one of the statements of Mill, he said that a utilitarian who believes in the perfect goodness and wisdom of God necessarily believes that whatever God has thought fit to reveal on the subject of morals must fulfill the requirements of utility in a supreme being. For those who are Christians, and by this I mean all the believers of Christ, their decisions on whether an act is good or bad, or right and wrong, may be heavily influenced by religion. And this might be their answer to the earlier question that we have posed regarding guiding principles. But aside from this, and for the others as well who have different beliefs, what are your guiding principles or criterion?
If you try to answer the question, here is another example. This is very prevalent in the Philippines. This is trolling. We see trolls on a daily basis on the different social media platforms who do nothing but attack social media users through bashing and or using ad hominem, spreading fake news, red tagging people, sending threats, among others that may be heavily damaging to the users. From the GWI 2020 report, the Philippines has been branded as the most social nation. Even if we see this as something good, it actually poses risks to our citizens, especially those in the social media sphere. So thinking of this using utilitarianism perspective, we know that trolls may be happy from what they are doing, as a lot of them are being paid to do the trolling work, but for the greater social media users, trolling causes pain, mischief, unhappiness, and even far more mental health problems that is damaging. This is trolling behavior or work then becomes misaligned with utilitarianism.
Now, to cap off the report, think about how utilitarianism can be applied when choosing a job or career. This may be applicable to us graduating students, as this is the next step for most of us, while others would pursue further studies. Would a utilitarian choose something that would make themselves rich, of high status, and something that is easy to benefit themselves? Or would they rather choose a job where it has an impact to the society? Surely you know what the answer is: a career that would maximize their potential while benefiting the society. A utilitarian will use this as a guiding principle in life, and they would want to live a life which would make a difference to others. They would make life decisions based on the good that it would bring for the majority and would put others first. Langit-lagi para sa bayan, as instilled to us by UP, not only in terms of career decisions, but in all aspects.
And that's it for our presentation. Thank you so much for listening and have a good day.